All right. Thank you for joining us. Today's webinar, Ensuring Occupational Health Research Benefits for All Workers, a Framework for Inclusive Research, is presented to us by Mike Flynn. At this time, I'm pleased to present our presenter, Michael Flynn. Mike is an applied anthropologist with over 25 years of experience working on issues related to social inequality, both domestically and abroad. His interests include health equity, organizational culture change, translational research, and social determinants of health. He currently serves as the lead social scientist with the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, or NIOSH, where he coordinates the Occupational Health Equity Program. He's also the project officer for a research program to better understand and improve the occupational health of immigrant workers. He has a master's degree in anthropology from the University of Cincinnati and is currently pursuing a PhD in anthropology from the University of Kentucky. Welcome, Mike, and thanks for joining us.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can. Thank you,
All right,
Mike.
now you see why I study anthropology and not IT. Well, thank you all very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be back again with you for this presentation. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. All of the slides have, all the images in the slides have embedded in them links to the different articles that I'll be talking about. And so if you're interested in finding out more, reading more up on what I'm talking about, you can just follow those links when you get the deck, and we'll go from there. So by way of introduction, I think over the past 50 years, occupational safety and health has largely developed into a technical field that's been guided mostly by the biomedical model of health. And this model of health seeks to isolate single proximate factors that cause an injury event or illness. And this is really part of the larger idea of a desocialization of scientific inquiry, which tends to focus on or ask only biological questions about what indeed are biosocial phenomena, right? However, our broadening understanding of the link between work and health, the restructuring of work currently going on, known as the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and the growing awareness of diversity and social inequality in society are just some of the challenges to this current paradigm, and they highlight the need for us to expand and complement this reductionist view of cause and effect to account for the social, political, and economic context that contribute to health outcomes. And the mission of the Occupational Health Equity Program at NIOSH that I coordinate is to promote research, outreach, and prevention activities that reduce avoidable differences in workplace injury and illness that are closely linked with social, economic, and environmental disadvantages. Central to this idea is that how we arrange society contributes to the inequitable distribution of positive and negative work-related health outcomes. And so we consider these differences avoidable because they're at heart the result of how we've chosen to arrange society, which means if we rearrange society or change these social arrangements, we can change the distribution of these outcomes. And there are three areas of interest that the health equity program focuses on. The first one is research focused on health inequities, work-related health inequities. And that's a presentation that I gave on April 6th in this same forum. And I believe they're going to put a link to that video in the chat if you're interested in hearing about that. Today, I'll be talking about the second area of interest that we have, which is integrating inclusive research practices across occupational safety and health. And then our third area of focus is the connection between work and health inequities writ large. And that I'll be talking about in the same place on November the 2nd. So I hope to see you all there. So when we talk about promoting inclusive methods, this comes out of the idea that, while we'd like to see more research focused on health inequities, we understand that not all research needs to be or even can be necessarily focused on specific health inequities as a centerpiece of what it's trying to do. That being said, we also recognize that all research, regardless of what the topic is or the focus in occupational health, needs to account for the diversity within the workforce to ensure that the results of that research benefit everyone equally, right? And underlying this is the idea that inclusion is not just an ethical concern, but it makes for better science. At the heart of this idea of inclusive research is the idea, while science is generally understood as a method for arriving at objective facts, and that's how it, I think, can generally be understood or defined, we also have to recognize that science is also bound by the social context within which it has developed and it's currently being practiced, right? Which is to say that exclusionary social structures in society not only influence the distribution of health and illness across different groups, but also influence how we study these differences, right? In other words, the way science is done has evolved to better meet the needs of some groups more than others. And so the first thing we need to do when we're talking about inclusive research practices is we need to turn the analytical lens back on ourselves and how we do things. Now, this is not as easy as it looks. Why? Because by and large, we're socially conditioned to accept things how they are, right? And which makes it difficult to identify exclusionary practices. As Edward Howell highlights, culture hides more than it reveals. And strangely enough, what it hides most effectively from its own participants. Therefore, the real challenge is not so much to understand the foreign culture, but to understand our own. And this is particularly difficult because much of the work on social inequities tends to focus on those suffering or in a disadvantageous position. We don't often focus on what it is that we bring to the table when we're studying these issues. And so when we talk about the dynamic of diversity, we're talking about more than just simply differences, right? We need a conceptual model that deals with the asymmetrical power relationships in society that are generated along social axes such as race, ethnicity, gender, sex, class, health, and well-being. So at the heart, we need a conceptual model that addresses power and privilege. We also need to understand that these are by and large the result of institutional arrangements, not personal flaws or personal beliefs, right? These exclusions are embedded, or inequities are embedded within social structures, right? So the goal, therefore, is to recognize and challenge these arrangements. It's not to pretend that we're somehow non-racist or outside a structure or a system that favors or privileges the experiences of one group over another. We have to recognize we're all in this society and therefore all affected by it in some way, shape, or form. And so the goal here is to recognize and change these arrangements, which is what we'll be talking about today. Of course, where you stand in society or your social position impacts what you see and how you see it, right? And so we really need to take heed of our own social position and the perspective we bring to the work. And one of the main ways these institutional arrangements are reinforced and maintained in society is by privileging the experience of the normative group, right? And this privileging of this experience, as defining it as the norm, is sanctioned and reinforced through things such as the media, laws, institutions. Really kind of as by the easiest way to explain it or culture is it's the box that we're continually told to think outside of, right? But that's a lot harder said than done. And one of the issues too, as I was mentioning earlier, another dynamic is that privilege is often unacknowledged and understudied. And so when we do look at disparities, we look at groups that are on the excluded end of things. They're the ones who are suffering the disparities. Rarely do we turn the lens back on those in power or those in privilege and ask, how is it that they got to where they are and maintain their position, right? Now, the good news and bad news is that culture is dynamic. Every day, every interaction, culture is either being challenged or being reinforced. And that's hopeful, I think, for me, because what it suggests is that even small steps we take can begin to have an impact on trying to work towards change. Now, there are many barriers to inclusive research and practice, too many to enumerate here. This is really what we think is a kind of a framework and a first step to trying to, engage the conversation. And so we've come up with 3 large buckets or categories of exclusionary research practices or dynamics within research that lead to exclusion. It's not comprehensive at all, but really it's more than presenting a comprehensive framework. What we're trying to do is simply begin a conversation. And so the first one is what we call structural invisibility. Basically, the idea here is that you can't fix what you don't see. And the way public health or occupational safety and health organizations see things is through data. And so, as the consensus report highlighted here suggests, there's significant limitations in the type of data around things like race and ethnicity and other social determinants of health that are collected by occupational safety and health systems, right? So if we don't have the data, we can't see what the disparities that may exist. And so one way is the content of what is or isn't included in surveillance systems or data collection systems. The article here to the right was a study that was done, again, turning the analytical lens back on ourselves, of 120 some odd data collection efforts conducted by CDC to determine to what degree and how they incorporated key demographic variables like race, ethnicity, language, and nativity. And it found that in 20 of the systems, race and ethnicity weren't collected at all, and so totally absent. And then in many other systems, there was a limited number of variables related to each of these things. So for example, only 32% collected place of birth, only 10% collected data on primary language. And the idea is here that even when variables like race and ethnicity may be incorporated, there aren't a detailed level of other variables that are incorporated that really flush out or highlight or reflect the lived experiences of people in these groups, and often treat the different groups as very homogeneous, right? And that the result is that it privileges the experience of the normative group, because if the normative group are US-born individuals, then why would you have to ask what language is spoken, right? And so then language becomes invisible. Second key contributing factor to structural invisibility are methods, right? One, in terms of the language used, what languages are the survey instruments translated into, and what languages are the interviews conducted in? Obviously, if data isn't being collected in the language you speak, well, then your data won't be collected and you'll be invisible, right? Also, in terms of recruitment methods, how are the recruitment methods, to which groups are they tailored to encourage and ensure participation in the data collection efforts, right? And also, who's collecting the data, and is that a trusted member of the community that you're trying to incorporate, right? Or of the representative of the diversity of the entire workforce you're looking at, right? Now, another thing, we kind of flip it around and talk about, structural invisibility really talks about how the experience of different groups in society aren't seen because data isn't collected or isn't collected well, right? This idea of invisible structures is that the way we analyze data once we do get it often makes the social elements or the social structures that contribute to inequities invisible. So oftentimes data analysis at the very basic level, when we look at disparities, oftentimes the extent of what we do is simply document the differences. African-American workers suffer more injuries relative to, white workers, for example, or Latino immigrants. And so and that sometimes is all you can do with a very large data set. But what needs to happen after that, either in the same analysis or a follow-up study, is asking why. What is contributing to those differences? And that's often the step that isn't asked or conducted, right? We ended it simply naming the differences. The other issue that we have with data analysis is we treat these social categories as confounders and statistically adjust for them when we do our analysis. The impact of this is that it treats these variables then as individual characteristics, often biological characteristics, rather than social constructs. And when we do that, we really make invisible the role that these social arrangements have in contributing to the differential distribution of health and illness in society, right? So for example, a colleague of mine, Kaori Fujishiro, likes to highlight this example of, she uses the example of urinary tract infections. So we know that women are at increased risk of urinary tract infection, and a contributing factor to that are the biological differences between men and women, for example. Unfortunately, often though, given those biological differences, it's often assumed that biology is the only contributing factor to those differences. And therefore, when we get the data we have, we either control or adjust for sex in the analysis, right? The problem with this is it hides, and oftentimes this is fine to do given what the population you're looking with, but sometimes that doesn't work for certain populations. And what happens when we do that is the social explanations or potential social contributing factors are not explored. And so I've got a video here, but of course, by making these social factors invisible, we can't account for their potential ability to or their potential contributions to this. And I've got a really brief short video here. Oh, wait. Actually, I think it's just. Well, it's not coming. Oh, there you go. Okay, let me see.
It is a good company and everything, but I don't really believe that they are very female friendly here. This is our outhouse. That's our little pee pot.
You pee in a can? You okay with that?
I guess I have to be.
And so we can see from that video, right, is that clearly there are at least for this population of worker, there could be some contributing factors to how the work is arranged and how differential access to, toilets, for example, may be impacting the distribution of urinary tract infections, at least among these workers. Right. But when we control for sex or adjust for it, and we don't analyze, we make that potential social contributing factor invisible. And then not only do we make it invisible, which impacts our ability to actually try and reduce these inequities, but it also reinforces the biomedical epistemology that, well, it's just a difference in the simple biology between men and women that are contributing to this. And then there's no social aspect to it at all. Right. And so what's the impact of invisibility? Well, first, health inequities aren't seen, right, and therefore don't exist. If we don't collect the data and analyze it, the public health institutions and occupational health researchers don't see the differences, right, or the disparities that exist, right? The other thing is that the social determinants of health inequities become hidden because we prioritize or favor the biological explanation rather than potential social factors, right? And this reinforces the predominant concepts, right? Such as biological explanations or treating race as an individual or biological variable rather than a social construct. It also reinforces the homogeneity of the idea that the different groups are homogeneous. And that there aren't class or differences within, the groups. Also, this informs the funding and funding for research and interventions, right? If we don't collect and document health inequities or how they occur, well, then that influences, justifying research questions and what research is funded, and also what programs are developed and for whom to address which health problems. And so we really need to be more intentional and explicit on what data we collect and why, how we analyze it and how we report those findings, and what are the limitations of our approaches. Maybe we can't, it's not easy to incorporate different fields into some of these large data collection systems. But we at least have to be conscious in mentioning what's not included in these limitations, and that they could be potential, factors for the stuff we're looking at, but we just don't have the data. The data isn't being collected to be able to analyze it. Now, the second key area of exclusionary research or inclusive research practices are what we call institutionalized exclusion. And here what we're looking at is that, bias, the idea here is that bias is often baked into the scientific models that we use and how we study things. What happens here is that the normative group often, or the normative group's experience, is often taken to represent the experience or be a placeholder or a stand-in for the experience of all humans, right? Of course, the data produced from these models is tailored to that normative group experience, which means it's more beneficial for members of that normative group because it reflects their reality, and the results are less beneficial for representatives of non-normative groups and their experiences, because it doesn't account for their experiences as well, right? So the key here is to identifying these exclusionary models is difficult, right? One, because we're conditioned to see science as objective, and so scientific methods are simply objective ways of getting at the truth. And we aren't taught to try and examine and question some of these methods and models to see if there isn't some unintentional bias baked into them, right? The other issue is that science is often has a unidirectional focus. It goes from the researcher to the observed group. I'm the objective observer that is studying this group or this phenomena or that phenomena. We aren't good at turning that analytical lens back on ourselves and seeing it really as both groups are bringing something to this interaction, right? And so institutionalized exclusions gets codified in both technical and conceptual scientific models, right? In terms of the technical models, we know, for example, there's a long-standing male bias in scientific modeling, as highlighted by, the book here. One of the examples that's clear that has, clear impact for occupational safety and health is the idea of the definition of a human being in toxicology as an 80-kilogram man. It used to be 70, now it's up to 80. And implicit in this model is that women and children are simply treated as smaller men, right? And then we obviously can see the fallacies and the challenges in that, right? And there's also bias in applied science, right? When we look at the designing of personal protective equipment, for example, it's often based on measurements or anthropometric data that was collected from military recruits in the mid-1900s. The result, and those military recruits were by and large white, male, and between 5'5" and 6 feet tall. So this bakes into, right, makes a poorer fit for, people who don't fit that profile. And therefore, women and ethnic racial minorities in the United States often find that their PPE doesn't fit them as well, or it's harder for them to get good fitting PPE than it is for someone who reflects those characteristics of the military recruits in the mid-1900s, right? And NICE has done some work to correct or these, exclusionary anthropometric data sets, right? We've done work on respirators, fall protection, seat belts, and others, and you can, follow the link to that blog there on what they've done, using by and large computer-based models to create a larger and more diverse anthropometric data, so to better inform and ensure the fit of these different safety, protective measures. And of course, what we're talking about is not just, well, these are historical examples that they currently exist today, and even new technologies are suffering from this bias. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence we've collected from safety professionals in the field that tell us when they go to test out exoskeletons for their workforce, by and large, they seem to have been, the design of the exoskeleton seems to have been based on the male body frame, and often women can't find it, can't get a good fit of the exoskeletons, or it's very uncomfortable for them to wear. Similar concerns have been raised about artificial intelligence and how the unintentional or unconscious bias of the programmers may be working its way into the programming of the artificial intelligence programs. And here you can see a blog we did on exoskeletons and health equity. How these things fit in our conceptual models is basically the idea that how we choose to frame and talk about issues, impacts how we see things. And so one of the ones I like to highlight is when we talk about hard to reach populations. A lot of the work I do is with immigrant workers, and they've been tagged for decades now as hard to reach because they don't speak English, because of numerous reasons. The problem with this is that when you talk about groups like this as hard to reach, for example, one, it implants in our mind, it frames how we see them. And implicit in how we see them, or implicit in this labeling, is the idea that, one, the focus is on that population. So immigrant workers, for example, and there's something about them or how they are that makes them implicitly hard to reach. And so, within this description is really, it either intentionally or more likely inadvertently blames the victim, so to speak. And it's something about that group that makes them hard to reach. And our perspective as researchers, we're seen as the objective neutral group, and they're outside the norm, so therefore they're hard to reach. But when we turn the analytical lens back on ourselves and kind of flip the script, if we start describing them as hardly reached populations instead of hard to reach, right, that changes the focus on the institutions. Well, why are they hardly reached? Well, who's in charge of reaching them? Well, we are, right? As institutions, as scientists, ethics demands that we incorporate, workers from all different backgrounds in the research that we do. And so the real question isn't what is it about them that makes them hard to reach, but rather, why haven't we developed the capacity to effectively work with them as well as we do with other normative groups, right? And so in short, the problem then becomes us and not them. And so it's very important that we that we need to identify and correct these conceptual framings, because they really do condition how we think about things and the directionality of where the change needs to happen, right? The third major area or barrier to inclusive research and practice is what we call unexamined assumptions. And so one, as I've mentioned before, I think at the heart of this is the idea that, researchers, physicians, occupational safety and health professionals, we're all social actors. We're not objective observers, right? There's no way we can stand outside of society and outside the influence society plays on us and look objectively at the experiences of any group or any phenomenon. We're part of this social milieu, and that impacts just as much our perception of things as it does the people that we're working with or collecting, or who are participating in our studies. But of course, as I mentioned before, this is often an understudied phenomenon, and the focus tends to be on the specific group of focus for the research, right? And so what we really need to do is we need to account for our own social position, right? And not just by saying, for listing off some demographic characteristics like, I'm a white male, et cetera, and I know that impacts how I see things, but really it needs to be a series of reflections that helps us understand how our social position impacts the way we see the world, the way we approach our work, and how we understand what it is that we're doing and how we're doing it. We also have to account for these asymmetrical relationships and recognize that the perceptions of some of us are treated differently as the perceptions of people from other groups or other experiences, right? And these unexamined assumptions can result in a couple of key issues, right? One is differential treatment, as highlighted in the article here, that looks at, it's a study of how occupational physicians treat, it was analysis of how they treat their Latino immigrant patients, for example. It's a very interesting study done by a colleague. And then this is basically the unconscious bias that a lot of people hear about. And that there's a lot of trainings on. It's how we may be conditioned to treat people with some characteristics different than people with other characteristics. Another way unexamined assumptions plays out is through an assumed common understanding, right? So the idea, when I say family, my understanding of what a family is, I don't even question that other people may understand it or see it differently. And so this is really the idea of the need to ensure there's conceptual equivalence, particularly in the data collection instruments we have, so that when we ask a question, right, that question is being heard in the same way as where it's being understood the same by the researcher and the person answering the question. And so I'll highlight here an example from our research. This is research that we did regarding the SF-36, which is a very common self-report health instrument. We did this with Latino immigrants. So this was all done in Spanish, but I've translated it here for the ease of presentation. And so the question in the SF-36 is, how many days of work have you missed in the past 4 weeks due to an emotional problem? And a common answer we'd get from the respondents would be none. And so had we left things there, right, and moved on to the next question, the scientific finding would be that Latino immigrants have few emotional problems, right? And they don't miss any work due to them, all right? However, recognizing that there could be some unexamined assumptions and that the way we were understanding things may not be the way that the respondents could understand them, we pilot tested the survey, even though it's been published in over 20,000, peer-reviewed journal articles, and even though, it's said to have gone through a validation process and all of these things for this specific population as well. We thought, we're going to run it through a cognitive testing protocol just to make sure that what we're understanding by the question is how folks are understanding it. And so a follow-up question with a small sample in this pre-launch of the survey was to ask them if they could give us an example of an emotional problem. Once they'd answer the question, and we said, well, could you give me an example what you mean by emotional problem? And so one of the responses was, well, the first time I rode a horse, I got so excited that I tried to make it run faster, and it threw me, and I got a bloody nose. So that bloody nose, that's an example of an emotional problem. And we also heard things like, well, cancer is an emotional problem because it's something inside you and you can't see it. It's not manifest itself on the outside. Or a heart attack is an emotional problem. Like, for example, when you go to a surprise party and you get so surprised that you have a heart attack, that would be an emotional problem. And so what we see here is that there are very different understandings. There's a significant differences in between how the researchers understood this concept and how the respondents understood the concept. And neither is wrong. You can see it from both perspectives, how they both make sense, right? But of course, those understandings aren't treated equally by society, right? And if we were to have left unexamined our perceptions as investigators and our understanding of what an emotional problem was, it then would remain, our interpretation of those two words remains the de facto norm of the study, and then becomes reified in scientific fact, which would have been at least, that Latino immigrants suffer, miss very few days of work due to emotional problems. And then that, of course, impacts, funding for future research and interventions. And so we can see here not only the importance of, or how unexamined understandings, manifest themselves, but also how they're not treated equally, and how the immigrant has their understanding, the researcher may have their understanding, but the researcher's understanding gets the full weight of science behind it, which controls future money and interventions. Whereas the immigrant one, if not analyzed or caught the difference, becomes invisible. So how do we correct this? One, we need to promote self-awareness and account for our own social position as researchers. And again, this is a complex process. It's not as simple as saying, well, all researchers come from a privileged perspective and all respondents don't, or come from a less privileged or excluded perspective. That's not the case. Oftentimes, as intersectionality tells us, we're a mix of both privileged and exclusion all in the same person. And it's really understanding how those different identities operate with and how they influence the way we see things that's essential. And so it's not just about hiring people from diverse backgrounds, but also running folks through a process of reflection to identify what their current social position is, how that reflects from the social position they may have come from, and how all of that interacts to either favor or hinder the way we interact with different groups, right? And another key concept is this idea of cultural humility versus cultural competence. The idea of cultural competence is an older idea that had its time, but really it assumes that somehow you can learn everything or be competent at knowing the details of a specific group. And so a cultural competent perspective would be, well, you would know already that emotional problems would be understood differently by the respondents in the example I gave earlier. And that's just too hard well, there are many issues with that I don't have time to get into. I prefer the idea of cultural humility much better, which is the idea of saying, look, I know I'm coming from a certain perspective, and I don't even know how that may or may not be shared with the people I'm working with. And so let's institute methods like cognitive testing and others to double check and make sure that the assumptions I'm bringing in, whether they're conscious or, inadvertent, get raised to the forefront so I can recognize them and then address them. And so when we talk methodologically, how do we correct this is basically we have to ask ourselves, how can we systemically identify these unexamined assumptions? And like I mentioned, one way of doing that is through a cognitive testing protocol for survey items and whatnot. And then the other key way too is ensuring that we have partners from diverse perspectives. Internally, that means really, and this is really where recent efforts around diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of dovetail with health equity, is we need research teams from diverse perspectives, but not only from diverse perspectives, but we need to create a culture of inclusivity so people can bring their opinions of those diverse experiences to the table when we're designing research and analyzing results. The other thing is we need to be sure that we're incorporating the perspectives of external partners from diverse backgrounds and perspectives as well, to ensure that the methods and data collection we're doing is inclusive of a wide swath of people from different backgrounds and doesn't default to the normative experience. And so just to talk a little bit about partnerships, right? This idea, like I said, of turning that analytical lens back on ourselves, first starting with how we even describe or frame what these different communities are. And the idea is that they're hard to reach, or that we really, or that they're hardly reached, and so the key question here is, why are we more effective reaching some communities and not others, right? We need to evaluate our current partners as well. Who are they and who do they represent, right? How are partnerships structured and whose participation does that structuring facilitate? So for example, larger companies tend to be overrepresented on, let's say, occupational safety and health advisory boards. Why? Because they have full-time employees dedicated to occupational safety and health who can take the time and get paid to participate in things like these, right? Small business owners don't have that luxury. And so when we structure advisory board meetings that take people out of town for several days at a time, right? Who's going to be, how does that structuring of that input favor certain groups from participating and other organizations from not being included, right? And also, to what level or how are these partners involved in our work? And I think the key here is that as we identify current problems and try and fix them, not only are we addressing that specific problem, but we're also building our capacity and relationships for future work down the road. So basically, if they see you fix it, if folks from the outside see you trying to fix and overcome the immediate barriers, and you're actually successful in that, they're more likely to stick with you to address additional barriers as you move forward. And then we also need to focus on building new partnerships, right? And we need to identify the existing infrastructure in the communities that have been historically underrepresented by our institutions, and reach out and develop partnerships with those infrastructures, right? And also recognize these are often heterogeneous communities. So there's no one group that can represent all Vietnamese immigrants, for example, right? There are multiple groups and they have their own structures within them, their class structures, their gender divisions and whatnot. And we have to recognize that and recruit, several groups to help account for the diversity within the groups that we're working with. And we also have to identify and address the structural barriers to partnerships, right? And so we like to take a systems level approach to sustainable partnerships. One, we try and build long-term sustainable relationships. All too often, collaborations in research begin and ends with a specific research project. We write the project, we get the funding, we get their support letter, we get the funding, we pay them to collect the data, we provide them results, and then we close up shop and leave, right? And so really the way we like to approach it is that all of our research is more than just a series of discrete projects, but with every project we have, not only do we need to address and answer the specific questions of that research, but also the way we do it needs to contribute to a long-term relationship with the groups we're working with. We also try and find ways of integrating occupational safety and health into the existing infrastructure and the activities that our partners are doing. By this way, we reduce the burden of implementing what we're asking them to do on the partners, which increases our return on investment. And it also makes these interventions more sustainable, because if we simply add on to what's currently being done rather than coming with a whole new program for them to implement, the likelihood of at least parts of that living on after the research funding ends are higher. And it also provides a sense of ownership of the community group around issues related to work and health or occupational health. And of course, involving partners from the very beginning and designing the research, identifying what the research questions are, and of course, including them in the budget and paying them for their expertise. So really looking at next steps to move towards a more inclusive research practices are: one, we need to integrate our understanding of science as a social construct and not as an exercise in objectivity, right? We need to identify and find solutions for exclusionary practices. Sometimes this is as simple as making exclusion visible, right? For example, the example of this 80-kilogram man. In toxicology, I don't have a solution for that, but at least we make it visible, right? And then of course, the next step would be, how do we develop more inclusive models? And so maybe there's a PhD student out there in toxicology that wants to find a way of using computer-based modeling to expand on that basic definition, for example, right? But just the fact that we're beginning to call it out and mention it, I think, is a step forward. We need to operational institutionalize the inclusive framework that I just went through here, right? How do we get researchers to integrate this into their proposals and how proposals are evaluated? Are we asking researchers to identify and look back on themselves and say, okay, well, what variables am I including and what analytical models am I including and how I'm going to analyze that data? And how does that either challenge or conform to current status quo or structural invisibility, for example? What models am I using that may be exclusionary? Like the 70-kilogram man or the PPE based on military recruits. And we also need ongoing oversight. And I think there's a real role for the IRB, for example, here, that, as you file your updates or your continued permissions every year, should double check and see, well, you said the goal was to recruit X number from each of these different minority groups. Have you actually done that? And we also need to address the social location of the researchers and increase the internal diversity and an inclusive culture of our research teams. and develop ethical partnerships with community-based organizations and social scientists. And in short, we're living through a time of significant change in society and in occupational safety and health, from what the definition of work is to, issues of social inequity and the entire pandemic. But times of great change also equal times of great opportunity and shake up the way things have been traditionally. And so I think it offers us significant opportunities to really take that next step and move towards a more inclusive practice in the research we do to ensure that it benefits, everyone and not just those from the normative or selective group. And so with that, I'd like to thank the health equity team here at NIOSH and let you know that invite you to the upcoming presentation on basically its work as a social determinant of health inequities as a way of selling work as an important variable for the rest of public health. And I'll be delivering that on November the 2nd. So I guess we'll open it for questions at this point.
Yes, thank you. Give me 1 second to get it all set up. Again, if you have any questions, please go ahead and add those to the Q&A box, and I will start with the ones at the top.
Okay, do you just want me to read them or?
Oh, no, I've got it.
Oh, okay. All right.
All right. So our first guest asked, sometimes the invisibility is also a function of protecting from racism. For example, for a long time, Black women's bodies were assumed to be different, experience less pain, etc. How do we collect and analyze without jumping to incorrect conclusions?
Yeah, I think this is where I would say the need when I talk about mentioning partnerships, and this I believe is something I talked about in my, the earlier presentation I gave on this, was, health equity research or just research in general, inclusive research doesn't mean just doing the same thing with a different group of people, right? And so if I've always conducted research with white males, now all I need to do to be inclusive is include Black women in my study group or in my sample, and all of a sudden I'm being inclusive. There are many of these social issues that influence, right, and create differential experience and differential consequences of the research we do and the way we report the findings. And so to me, the best thing you can do is, don't assume you're competent at dealing with social issues and social structures if you don't have experience doing that. And so what you need to do is really find experts either with that population or in health equity research and bring them on board and incorporate them into your team. And just don't assume that it's something as simple as asking, of including people from different groups that you aren't used to working with into your study or collecting data on them. So hopefully that's it. But to me, it's all about partnerships and bringing that expertise onto the team if you don't have it or haven't developed it yourself. Because you can, like they say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And so you can be trying to do the right thing and actually end up hurting people more than you're helping.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. The next question is, was it mentioned if survey participants did indeed miss work due to emotional issues once the understanding was met?
Yeah, unfortunately, the whole goal of that study that we did was actually just cognitive testing the SF-36 to determine, whether it was appropriate for use with this population. We didn't take it to the next step to actually collect that data. That wasn't part of the protocol. So I don't have the answer to that, but just given the number of responses, that people said on the different ways they understood it, it wasn't an effective question, or we didn't find it to be effective, at least with the study population we would have used it on. But unfortunately, I don't have that data because we didn't do that next step.
Thank you. The next question is a little bit longer, so I'm going to go ahead and read through it. Have NIOSH scientists parsed the following issue in papers or monographs? We've all read some older occupational cohort studies in which only white male workers were eligible for the cohort, presumably because there were relatively few women and non-white workers compared to the adequately large number of white males. Perhaps we uncritically accepted medical model thinking to that effect. Okay, so we move to the question. Recently, I had an experience with these issues with the Government Advisory Committee where concerns about social bias and statistical bias quickly got messy, due in part to two types of bias by non epidemiologists. In light of your presentation, I'm beginning to think that epidemiologists' thinking might have been muddy along. What do you think about that?
Yeah, in a short, yes. I think there probably is some. If you see there's an article, let me see if I can get to it here. It's not one that I wrote. It's a classic, but it's about, it talks about how epidemiology treats race and how it could be done better. This one, race, racism, and the practice of epidemiology. So I'd recommend you look at that and start reading there and then following where that article's been cited. I think it'll give you, I don't have time to get into the specifics of it, but yeah. The other thing I think you'll find a more humorous take on it, but equally as egregious, is this episode of Oliver that put on where he talks about how there was a study done, I think in 1990, on hysterectomies, I believe, and the sample was strictly male. And so anyway, there are things where, looking back on it, it's like, how in the world did this happen? But again, it's that box that we're taught to think in, and the scientific explanations we're given, and we're taught that those make sense, and so we simply replicate them uncritically. And that's really the hardest thing to do, because it's ingrained in how we do things. And when we don't do it that way, we're punished, right? We're not funded, or we don't get a good grade on the assignment, et cetera. And so really, it's how do we begin to question these things and identify them?
Thank you. And again, we have one more question and then a couple comments. I'll do those first. Really interesting, informative, and eye-opening presentation. A lot of thanks and very thought-provoking, so everyone's appreciating that. And let's see. So how do you compensate for underrepresented groups? For example, if you only rely on online responses, many groups do not like or maybe participate in online programs. So how maybe do you create some of that outreach?
Well, I mean, and one thing would be you'd have to know that, is that in fact, if your only method is online and that's what you're proposing, then you may say, well, these groups don't like that, so I'm already biasing my sample. And so you may have to add another model of data collection, which is face-to-face. I think the other thing, at least when I approached the work on COVID we've been doing with immigrant workers in the seafood processing industry, for example, I assumed that they wouldn't be into social media as much as they are, but the community partners we worked with have done a significant amount of outreach on social media, far to my more than I thought they'd be able to do. And so it may be one that you need new methods. If that is indeed the case, it may also be that we just simply have a prejudice and think they aren't as technically savvy as they might be. So yeah, it would just be a matter of knowing the audience and really investigating that and confirming what you think by going to community groups that represent the groups you're looking at.
Yes, thank you. Okay, we have one more question, one more comment. The comment, great presentation. Glad to see this type of work occurring, especially for occupational environmental health and safety professionals such as themselves. And then the last question, how can someone analyze consequences of years of differential treatment afforded on a certain group of employees who observe unequitable advantages such as promotions and training as they're offered to quote unquote clique members?
Analyze consequences, years of differential treatment. Within the research setting or within like a group of workers you're studying, where some workers from certain groups are privileged, and what's the impact of that privileging? I mean, if it's the second of the two, I think you'd look at things like, cumulative stress and disengagement and racism and other research that's been done on issues of discrimination and whatnot in the workplace. How do we unpack the differential treatment that's been done in science and the scientific findings that have been resulting from some of these exclusionary methods? Honestly, I don't know how to go back and redo everything. I think what we really have to do moving forward, like I said, is trying to identify where these exclusionary practices are currently being conducted, and then begin to, like I said, if nothing else, at least make them explicit in the limitations sections of our research proposals and our articles that we write, best case scenario to get people to actually work on developing solutions and more inclusive practices.
Thanks again. And we are approaching time. I want to thank everybody for your participation. I want to thank Mike, as always, for all of your really just great expertise and bringing some of this information so that everybody can kind of pick up on it and take from it and grow. And again, there is going to be one more webinar in this series in November. We'll send out more information to your emails. Thank you again for everybody who comes out, for who participates, and I think that as we all share this knowledge, we can only grow as an OSH community. If anybody has any questions, please, you can email me, coehce@berkeley.edu, but I will be emailing you tomorrow with a copy of the presentation, a copy of the slides, and the certificate evaluation form. So yes, thank you again. Thanks everybody. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, and please feel free to reach out to me. My email's on the final slide. If you have any further questions or want to follow up discussion one-on-one, I'd be happy to do that.
All right, thank you. Take care, everyone. Have a great afternoon.